Eagles Entertainment.
With the 10th pick in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Philadelphia Eagles select.
You're listening to the Journey to the Draft podcast.
Welcome to the Journey to the Draft podcast, presented by Life Brand. I'm your host, Fran Duffy, and today we're going to continue our process series where I'm going to catch up with a longtime NFL scout, which had a career that included a tenure here in Philadelphia, but most recently down in Dallas with the Cowboys. That man is Bryan Broaddus. You can find him on Twitter. You can follow him just like I do, at Bryan Broaddus. But Bryan has been in the league for a long, long time. He does now daily radio down in the DFW, but he shares so many great memories and so much great insight into the scouting process, how he evaluates players, who he learned from. It's just an awesome conversation that I hope you all enjoy. We are now just under a month away from our conference previews here for the 2021 college football season. So make sure you stay tuned right here on the Journey to the Draft podcast feed. Stay subscribed, and we'll be back with those 2021 prospects just in a few weeks. It's going to be fun to dig into that with Ben Fennell and Dane Brugler. As always, go on. If you've got time, leave us a rating, leave us a comment. It's the best way to throw us your support. Even this time of year when it's a little bit slow, there's not as much news. We're not talking about rankings yet and talking about grading players. But if you get some time, really, really appreciate all the support everybody gives us. And if you've got a question, leave it on there and we will answer it right here on the show. That said, let's get into my chat now with Bryan Broaddus in Mr. Relevant.
It's time for Mr. Relevant.
Well, excited this week to welcome to the Journey to the Draft podcast presented by Life Brand, a guy who was in the NFL for a long, long time. And we're going to get all into his background and his evaluation process. Longtime NFL scout, Bryan Broaddus. Bryan, thanks for joining us here on the show.
Hey, appreciate that, Fran. You guys do a heck of a job with your podcast. So really an honor to be on with you guys.
No, obviously, anybody at the NFL, you should be listening down to the draft show. You guys have been doing a great job for years down there in Dallas. I guess let's go back to the beginning, though, and I want to start off there. Take us through your background, just how you got to where you are today. You had a great career working in the NFL as a scout. So I'm interested, and that included a stop here in Philadelphia, by the way. So take us through that. How did you get started, and how did you progress?
Well, it really, being 57 years old now, it seems like a long, long time ago getting started. But actually, when people ask me, how do you get going in scouting? And, my route was really as a college recruiter. When I finished playing at LSU, was fortunate enough to stay on at LSU on the staff there as a student assistant, and, really got to work with I was like the pro liaison, between the university or the football department and the NFL scouts coming through. At that time, they used to have to watch, like 16 millimeter tape.
Yep.
So it's funny. I mean, like I'd hand them the tapes, and if they needed anything, I'd talk about our players and stuff like that. And I got to know a lot of scouts along the way doing that. And so I always thought it was an interesting type of a job. But I was really looking at being a college recruiter. I wanted to evaluate, high school kids and, and bring them into our program. And I got to do that and at LSU and then at Texas A&M. And then from Texas A&M, I got a chance to work in the World League and at the very first year of the World League. And that's where I got the exposure to the pro football aspect, having to evaluate college players, not just high school players, but then we were evaluating players that had been in NFL camps. And I was very fortunate to be with a really good group of guys that, were, that later went on to having success in NFL as scouts, the Jeff Beathard's, the Lionel Vitals, the Derek Jensens. I mean, I was with a really good group of scouts, and, we were all really young. And that's what, was neat, that we were all, learning from each other, the experiences that we'd been there. And, and one of the guys at the NFL Europe, Chet Franklin, my boss, who was a longtime general manager, he's with the Raiders, the Chargers and things. He goes, listen, when the time's right, I'm going to get you a job in the NFL. And he did. On my 27th birthday, Ron Wolf, the Green Bay Packers, I meet him in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And he's like, I meet him on a Monday, and he asked me on a Thursday if I can come to Green Bay. And I just packed my bags and went, and that's, a lot of it is right place, right time, but you have to be with the right people, but you also have to be with the, getting experience along the way. And I was very fortunate because of college football and then also NFL Europe And then it allowed me to be then with a group of scouts like John Dorsey, Scott McLuhan, John Snyder, Sean Herrock. I mean, I was with a great group of guys there too. And so it made it all really work out for me to not only learn, but to get the experience. And then, having the opportunity to come to Philadelphia, Jeff Lurie, Joe Banner, Mike Lombardi, all those guys. I mean, it was to get to run a draft after, Dick Daniels had been relieved of his job. I felt like at 35 years old, I was ready to go. We were ready to do this. And the draft worked out fine for us. And, and Andy Reid, came along, drafted Don McNabb. And, for 14 years, that football team was hard to beat.
No question. And you come from, you talked about that Ron Wolf tree, and obviously that is still present to this day. As you mentioned, some current NFL general managers, longtime NFL general managers. And it's so funny too, because you talked about a lot of it is about who you know early on, and people will say, oh, well, then it's just luck. I'm a big believer in that you make your own luck, especially it's along any line of business, but especially in this line of work, because it's not just about happenstance and who you come across, but how you make the impression you make on those people, and that is a reflection of your work and your process.
You're absolutely right, Fran. And it's you got to be willing along the way to make sacrifices. There were plenty of times where it wasn't the most glamorous thing in the world, and that's what people think. Oh, scouting is a really glamorous job and all that. It's tough work.
Yeah.
It really is tough work. But if you're getting around the right people, and the most important thing I could always say to people that want to be scouts or, want to go into that field, the young people, is like, yeah, you have to be willing to just do anything to get your foot in the door and get going, and I remember, because we talked about John Snyder, and, John's a very successful general manager in Seattle. John was my intern in Green Bay. I mean, the only intern that ever worked for me was John Snyder. And now he's my $3.5 million a year intern, kind of a thing. So
you're batting 1,000 then, Brian.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing that, and I talk to John about it all the time. And, John was willing to do anything. John came out of, St. Thomas College there in Minneapolis. He was from Green Bay. I mean, he was pestering Ron Wolf for a job. I mean, he really was. And finally, Ron came to me and it's like, listen, I got this guy. Can you do something with him? And I'm like, well, if you want me to help him along, I could do that. And John came in the office, and, John and I worked together a lot. I never gave him a job I wouldn't do myself, but he learned. He was willing to do that. And you make sacrifices along the way. I'll tell you a funny story. It deals with coaches too. At Philadelphia, when I was there, John Gruden's the OC, David Shaw's the wide receivers coach, and Sean Payton is getting people coffee. Yep. That just shows you, though, if you get with the right people, you get to the right place, eventually you figure things out, and then you get your own opportunities. So, yeah, don't be afraid to throw your hat in there and try and get the opportunity to do it if you have that passion to do it.
For our listeners, if you go to like Pro Football Reference and you go look at some of those Eagles staffs, whether it's scouting or coaching from like the late 90s, early 2000s, especially the coaching staff, what Andy Reid was able to do in putting that group together, a bunch of really young guys that have gone on to big things, 7, 8, 9 future head coaches at least on that list. Introducing Season 2 of the Return Game podcast, Birds, Boys, and Bad Blood, presented by NovaCare Rehabilitation. When it comes to the Eagles-Cowboys rivalry, you think you know the whole story, but there is more, so much more, and we're about to uncover it all. And I think back to some of my favorite memories in the rivalry, and I remember exactly where I was, who I was with, what I was doing for so many of these games. Lito Shepard's interception to ruin T.O.'s return to Philly. I remember leaping off the couch in my house where I grew up and nearly punching the ceiling. I jumped so high. The pickle juice game. I was actually on a family vacation in Disney World. We made sure we were back at our hotel so that we did not miss that game. 44-6. I remember I was watching that game from a bar near the mall where I was finishing up Christmas shopping. Earlier that day, I was with one of my best friends. Obviously, we couldn't miss the game, so we made sure we were geared up up. We had a good spot in front of a big screen. We went through like 18 plates of appetizers that day. And I have these memories because these games meant so much and continue to mean so much to us as Eagles fans. So if you want to relish some of those great moments in the rivalry, be sure to go subscribe to Return Game, an Eagles Entertainment original podcast. Subscribe now wherever you listen to podcasts. Let's get into your evaluation process. You're sitting down to watch a college player for the first time. Do you have like a checklist that you're going through? How many games do you watch? How do you pick those games? What is the early stages of the evaluation process like for you?
Yeah, Fran, I think that, and again, I call myself Krusty, the old scout, because there's the kids nowadays. I mean, it's funny that, I don't know how well kids are trained nowadays to go out. I don't know if they're information gatherers or real scouts. The real scout was the guy that had an idea, had a say, and what was going on, how to build the board and stuff. Maybe there's a lot of these organizations now that have these guys and gals that go out and they gather information and they have a real say. So my way of doing things was when I was always sitting down with a player, and I just remember this from Green Bay, is because we had position specifics that we were looking for, whether it was a wide receiver, was it, hands, catch radius, route running ability, blocking. I mean, there's a checklist you go through. And, when you're starting out, you want to make sure, okay, this is what the coaches want on our particular team. So you're looking for those traits and characteristics, and you're trying to find that, do all those position specifics match with what we're trying to do. And, and if you do that, then it makes it a little bit easier to say, okay, well, now let's go get the character stuff and all that other things. But I think watching tape is so important nowadays. And, people, they talk about numbers and 40 times and heights and weights and speed. And I'm going to be honest with you, Fran, I would have never believed in my life that there was a 5'9" quarterback that would be taken first overall. And all of a sudden you get guys like, Baker Mayfield and Kyler Murray and those guys. In my day, those 5'9" quarterbacks would have probably been taken in the 5th, 6th round. But here they are now. And that just shows you how different. And scouts, I think, over the years have had to change, especially the crusty ones like myself, have had to change how they look at this game. Because now the coaches, the way these kids coming out of college, it's not the prototypical players anymore. So you have to have a little bit more of an understanding like, okay, this guy's a little bit shorter. I could play him here and we could get away with it. Or like, okay, this guy's a little bit shorter, but man, I know he's going to go out there and he's going to ball. I'm not going to have to worry about him. He can cover. He's competitive. He runs well enough. He can make up for all the things that the shortcomings of literally lack of height. So yeah, it's really different because of the position specifics you're trying to go through. And that's what you're doing. If you can check off, as they say, those boxes, then you have a better idea of being able to fill in all the other blanks.
When you would try to pick the games, would you say like, all right, I'm going to start with best competition first? Would you look at the box score and say, hey, he was really productive here, he wasn't productive here, these are the first 2 games? Would you do rivalry games, bowl games? Like how would you try and prioritize that?
Yeah, Fran, back in the day, we used to when we'd sit down in Green Bay or Philly, and I remember, especially in Philly with those guys with Dan Shonka and Jake Hollum and Mark Ross, and we're going through that. We were looking through every competitive situation. Like if Florida State and Miami were going at it, and what would happen was you would be looking at that game, you'd be watching a specific player at Florida State, and then all of a sudden you'd find yourself peeking at 3 other guys at Miami, and then I'd ask like Dan Shonk, I'd go, Dan, what's that guy? Who's that guy that like Florida State, that defensive tackle? He's like, oh, Brian, he's only a sophomore. Don't worry about him. So then you'd go back to watching. But yeah, you always try and get those games. And, I remember some of these general managers are really good at picking small school guys, and being able to work that competition. I mean, I'm watching the other day, well, not the other day, a couple of years ago, the Hobart, Ali Marpet has Hobart. I'm watching him. I've never watched Hobart tape in my life. And I'm watching him, and they got a bounce house out past the end zone out there. And I'm just laughing at, like, this is scouting. This is what scouting's all about. But generally, you try and get the best tape. Like if you're doing Ali Marpet from Hobart, who was a 2nd round pick by the Bucks, you're watching that Senior Bowl stuff close. because you're trying to figure out how he's going to play against that type of competition.
And especially this year, this past draft cycle, it was so unique for guys, that didn't play this year. So it was like, okay, we can either watch the 2019 tape or we can watch 16 months later when he goes to the Senior Bowl. And you had so many guys, that had that kind of situation, right here in the division. Ellerson Smith, the pass rusher from Northern Iowa, you watch his 2019 tape and it's like, all right, yeah, like, this guy, there's something there. And then he goes to the Senior Bowl and he looked really, really good. He ends up being a fourth-round pick. I think that's a really interesting kind of situation. It's what made it unique here this draft cycle. When you reflect on your career and you look at the way that you've grown as an evaluator, what do you feel were your biggest strengths and are your biggest strengths as you're watching college players and projecting them?
I'll tell you what, Fran, I'm getting better at looking at those quarterbacks. I'm getting better at it. It's been a long run, but I'm getting better at that. I think that to me that, I've always had because when I first started in college, always back I was talking about in recruiting, I was an offensive lineman at LSU, and then I worked with the offensive line coach there before I got into recruiting. So I've always felt like I had a really good understanding of those offensive linemen. I'm getting better at receiver. The cornerback one is still a challenge at times, but if you ask enough questions, when I was in, working in the NFL in 2005, I would go up to players. I would go up to the players on our team, and I would, especially the ones that were young that were competing against these guys that I were watching in college, and I'd ask them questions, or I'd ask them questions about, listen, when you see the guy run this or do that or catch the ball this way or whatever, how do you judge? Like, well, this is how you evaluate that. And so not only was I taking my scouting stuff, what I was learning from my team, but I was also learning from players too, what they saw. And I think that helped me so much, for some positions that I wasn't very strong. I'm getting, I still feel like I can evaluate that offensive line. I feel like I can, got a pretty good handle on defensive tackles and safeties and linebackers. But there's some positions that scouts will admit, we just can't. I'm not very good at this. And, if your boss knows that, if your boss knows that you're weak in an area, then, maybe you got somebody else. I know for a fact working at Green Bay, Scott McLuhan was really good at quarterbacks. Scott was, and so everybody had a position on that staff in Green Bay. And then, when I got to Philly, everybody had a group that they were good at. And you just draw on the strength of that as a group, and then you put your board together that way. But if you're not good at an area, you can't force it, but you got to find your way. You got to find a way to go to resources and say, listen, I know you're good at evaluating these corners. Tell me what you're looking at. Tell me what you're seeing here. Sit down and watch this game with me and explain why this guy is one of the top corners or why this guy is a fourth-round corner. I think you have to, along the way, admit that you're not that strong at it, but willing to go put the work in to make it try and get better for you.
Whether it was in Green Bay, Philly, anywhere that you had been, were there situations where, like, okay, your general manager set up, look, you're going to cross-check, Bryan. You're going to be the cross-check for O-line, D-line. Right. Was that typically where you would get pegged to work?
I would. Yeah, I would. I was really good, like I say, with the offensive line. And I was – anytime I could sit down, and what's been really cool about these drafts the last few years is there's been some quality offensive tackles, and it's been fun. It's been fun to try and put them in order of how you would see them, and then you watch them play, and you're like, I knew I had that right. I knew I had that in the right order. So, yeah, I think that to me, it was more about let me cross-check these offensive linemen. And the really good general managers, the really good directors of player personnel will know the strengths of their scouts. Yeah. That you could hear if you're sitting in a meeting, Fran, with 10 other guys and you listen to guys read reports, you know what they're strong in. And if you're with the group long enough too, you're like, man, that guy is just nailing these linebackers. And I think as a boss, you would say, well, okay, I'm going to put my best guy on those guys. And not that you're right all the time, but if you get a guy that is constantly getting players right, and then the group is like, I don't see it. And then all of a sudden that guy's right, that player turns into a great player. Then you learn now, okay, maybe I need to give that guy his due as an evaluator.
Who would you say were your biggest influences when you reflect back on your career?
Wow, that's a great question. Because I was very fortunate, like I said, to be, in NFL Europe. Again, Chet Franklin was, he's the one that got me into the NFL. And, Chet, long time worked with the Raiders, Al Davis, that whole crew. I mean, you can learn a lot talking to those Raider guys. I mean, the history of that scouting department is incredible. But I think that, with the Packers, Ron Wolf, because he was a guy that he took the time to train scouts. And I don't think we do that enough in this day and age. I don't think I'll tell you what Ron did. There's a famous scout who passed away, C.O. Bricado, that you probably know C.O.
Yep.
In his old Houston Oilers, Tennessee Titans, old school scout, drove this area, every time he went to a school with him, everybody loved him, kind of a thing. He was getting information. When I first went out scouting, Ron sent me to Iowa City, to the University of Iowa, and to meet C.O. Bricado. And C.O. took me around and showed me how to scout. And I think those are the days I remember where I'm like, listen, just sit here and shut up and listen to what he's asking as he's interviewing these coaches, talking to the trainers, the weight room coaches, learn that way. And I think that's where today, if I was running a department, I would make sure my guys are trained that way. I don't think it's unfair to these young scouts to say, okay, you're now a scout and we're just going to throw you in an area and hope for the best. I don't think that's a great way to have your group run. But, like I said, the Chet Franklins, the C.O. Bricados, the Ron Wolfs, those guys were really, really big. I was very fortunate, like I said, going to the combine too, sitting up there at the 40-yard, timing with those old guys. I worked with two guys that worked on Vince Lombardi's staff when I was in Green Bay. Here I am, 27 years old. These guys were winning NFL championships when I was pooping green in my diapers. That's how what these guys were doing. So, if you can get around guys like that they just, they take the time to show you the right way, man, you can gain so much of doing a scouting that way. But like I say, that influence in Green Bay, that the way I learned, today, I mean, they still talk about it and they still do it in Green Bay that way, whether it was Ron Wolf, Ted Thompson, and now Brian Gutekunst. That's how they do it.
No, and I think you look around the league, and a lot of those guys carry those traditions, those trends along with them, from that Ron Wolf tree. To me, like the draft process, you start that off around this time of year, right? So we're talking like June, July, August. That board, you're going to have 1,000 guys up, in that list. And then for the months of August all the way up and through, the combine pro days, it's all about whittling it down and just kind of eliminating guys, whether it's athletic thresholds, whether it's character stuff, injury stuff, everything along the way is going to try and whittle that board down to that number that you're trying to aim.
No, you're absolutely right, Fran. And again, you go to these meetings, you go to the national scouting meetings, and they used to be in Longboat Key, Florida, or you go to used to be back in Tulsa, Oklahoma back in the day. They move them all over the place now, or they take them to Indianapolis, and you get your initial list. You might have 1,200 names, and then by the end of that, you're down to 140. And I remember just the look on people's faces when we would set our board, and they would look at it. The people had never seen that, and they're like, "How do you?" You're going to run out of names. There's 260 some odd pick. You're not going to have enough names. And I go, trust me, you're going to have enough names. You're going to have 6 names left over on that board. Get ready.
Do you feel like there are parts of this process that kind of get overblown in terms of like the discussion in the media and amongst fans, or the opposite way as well? Maybe it's a little bit undersold. Is there any side of the ledger for you when it comes to this entire draft process?
Wow. I think the thing that we've learned that, especially in this last draft cycle, is the combine is not overrated. If you're one of those people that think, oh, you could just do this without the combine, you taxed 32 teams is what you did.
Right.
And it's not just about showing up and having a steak at St. Elmo's, and enjoy. I mean, it's medicals, it's height and weights, it's let me tell you what, Fran, it's arm length measurements. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's one guy doing 325 arm lengths instead of instead of like you got 75 different. I mean, every these pro days, it's like, well, he's short armed, he's long armed. Well, how do we know? I mean, one guy's measuring arms differently than another guy. I mean, how do we? The one thing about the combine was the uniformity of it all. And I think that's the medical stuff, the workouts, the interviews. I mean, that was fascinating that we were able to pull this thing off without the combine pretty much. But man, I don't think they ever want to go through that again, where the scouting process where people are saying, oh, you could do this without the combine, because you really can't. I mean, yeah, we did it, but you could too. I guarantee you ask 32 directors of player personnel or general managers, every one of them will tell you, we do not want to go through that again, what we did last year.
I mean, how many guys fell? And this was just from what we know from the outside. How many guys fell because of the late medical information? It wasn't even a medical failure. It was a medical unknown because they were still waiting on final tests, that information to come back. And that affected a lot of where guys got drafted.
No, there's no question. You know, the one thing when you do that, when you set that board, you've got that tape you've watched, you've got the workouts you've done, and you've got that medical information. And that's how you set your board. And guys go up and down that board because of the things I just talked about. And there were times that the scouts and those guys in April, they're trying to set their board, and they're like, okay, well, we've got these numbers, but as you said, friend, we don't have this medical information yet. We're waiting on this MRI. And now it's like, okay, when are we going to get that MRI? Well, we're supposed to get it tomorrow. Okay. So yeah, that was tough. And that part of it is not to be just pushed aside. Thought, oh, we can do this without it. Yeah.
Did you have a guy over your career? I mean, I'm sure obviously there were lots of them, but that stands out to you, where like, man, I just love this guy on tape, but they get that failure from the medical staff, and you're like, well, we got to take him off the board.
I'll tell you what. I'll tell you a story, and it wasn't coming off the board, but again, because I'm on with you. When we did the draft in Philly, the Jeremiah Trotter pick. And I will give Jeff Lurie 100% credit for this pick, because we being myself, Mark Ross, Dan Shanka, and that coaching staff that, you know, with Emmett and those guys and Joe Vitt and you know, it was like, you know, we love Trotter. And I remember the doctor in Philly going, Bryan, he's got a bad knee. He's got a bad knee. And I remember standing there with Mr. Lurie, and the doctor says, I can't tell you if he's going to play 10 games or 10 years. And I remember my heart just sinking, you know, because I'm thinking, we're not going to be able to take this guy. We're just not going to be able to do it. And Jeff Lurie says, Bryan, if we like him enough, let's take him. Let's do it. And I looked at him and I'm like, thank you. Thank you for doing that. And we got the player. And Jeremiah Trotter played like 13, 14 years.
I was just going to say, he played 11 years. You've been all right.
Exactly. He had a heck of a career. You know, it was one of those things. And I'm just grateful that you know, that's the way it's supposed to work.
Well, Bryan, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Journey to the Draft podcast, sharing some stories from your time as a scout in the NFL. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you soon, hopefully.
Well, thank you, Fran. Appreciate it. You guys keep doing great work out there. Love listening to what you guys do, and it's always fun to reminisce with you a little bit.
Well, great stuff there from Bryan Broaddus. Hope you guys enjoyed those stories. Hope you enjoyed the insight. I know I learned some stuff. I took a bunch of notes during that conversation. Appreciate Bryan joining us once again here on the Journey to the Draft podcast. Stay tuned. We'll be back next week. Myself, Ben Fennell, Dane Brewer, some combination of the three of us. We'll be back later next week, and our process series will continue. I've got a special guest lined up for next week, a former NFL scout and quality control coach. So we'll be chatting with him later next week, as well as we continue our process series right here on the Journey to the Draft podcast, presented by Life Brand. Download the official mobile app of the Philadelphia Eagles. Catch breaking news, see real-time stats, watch live or on-demand video clips, listen to Eagles podcasts, and so much more. Now you can stay in touch with the Eagles anytime, anywhere.